There is a piece of footage circulating now that shows something almost nobody outside a small circle had ever seen before. Quiet, private corners of the massive log estate Barbara Mandrell built at the height of her fame. For decades, the public only knew fragments of this place, a magazine photo here, a passing mention there. Now that the fuller picture has surfaced, people are asking a simple but haunting question. Why did a woman who had everything a country star could want walk away from the stage, sell her instruments, and quietly disappear into these hills? To understand the footage, you have to understand the woman, and to understand the woman, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. Barbara and Mandrell arrived in the world on Christmas Day, 1948, in Houston, Texas. Even her birthday seemed to hint at something set apart from ordinary life. From the time she was old enough to hold an instrument, it was obvious she wasn't like other children. She started on accordion, but it was the steel guitar that revealed the true scope of her gift. Anyone who has ever tried to play a pedal steel guitar will tell you it is one of the most physically demanding instruments in all of music. The player slides a metal bar across the strings with one hand while picking with the other, all while both feet work pedals and both knees push against levers that bend the pitch mid-note. Adults spend years failing to get comfortable with it. Barbara Mandrell mastered it well enough to perform professionally by the time she was 11 years old. That was only the beginning of her range. Over the following years, she would become fluent on guitar, bass, saxophone, mandolin, and more, building the kind of complete musicianship that most performers never achieve in a lifetime. By the time most kids her age were worrying about homework, Barbara was already circulating in rooms full of professional musicians who had decades of experience on her. At 11, she played steel guitar at a trade convention and caught the attention of established Nashville figures. At 13, she appeared on national television. As a teenager, she toured with the Johnny Cash Show, playing steel guitar behind legends like Patsy Cline and George Jones. She was a child standing shoulder to shoulder with icons, and she held her own. Music was the family business. Barbara's parents and her two younger sisters, Louise and Earlene, were all part of it, and when a family band needed a drummer, they brought in a young Navy man named Ken Dudney. Nobody could have guessed it at the time, but that hiring decision would eventually reshape the entire direction of Barbara's life. Here is where her story takes its first sharp turn, one that surprises people who only know her as a superstar of the 70s and 80s. In 1967, at 18 years old, Barbara Mandrell married Ken Dudney. By her own account, she had already spent 8 years working professionally in music, and she felt ready to close that chapter and become a Navy wife instead. She meant it. She stepped back from performing and settled into a quieter existence built around her husband's military career. It didn't last. While Ken was on deployment, Barbara went with her family to watch a live taping at the Ryman Auditorium, home of the Grand Ole Opry's television broadcast. Sitting in the audience, she watched Dolly Parton perform, and something in her reawakened. The pull toward music, which she had tried to set aside, came roaring back stronger than she expected. She turned to her father and told him she wanted back in, if he would manage her. His response has become part of country music lore. He told her he would bet his last penny on her. In 1969, she signed with Columbia Records in Nashville, and the young woman who had nearly settled into permanent retirement as a Navy wife instead launched the career that would define an era of country music. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, Barbara Mandrell became one of the most versatile and commercially successful artists Nashville had ever produced. She wasn't confined to a single style. Her music moved comfortably between traditional country, soul, R&B, and pop, and she had the vocal ability and musicianship to make every genre shift feel effortless rather than forced. Her first #1 country hit came in 1978 with Sleeping Single in a Double Bed. From there, the hits kept coming. If Loving You Is Wrong, I Don't Want to Be Right, Years, and the song most closely tied to her name and her identity, I Was Country When Country Wasn't Cool, released in 1981. That song did more than climb the charts. It became a kind of anthem, a statement of authenticity that country audiences embraced as their own. Across her career, she released 27 studio albums, 7 of which reached the country top 10. The honors that followed were historic. In 1980, and again in 1981, Barbara Mandrell won the Country Music Association's Entertainer of the Year award, becoming the first artist in the genre's history to win that top honor 2 years running. Grammy Awards, American Music Awards, and Academy of Country Music honors followed as well. In an era when men dominated most of country music's biggest stages, Mandrell's consecutive wins were more than personal achievements. They widened the door for the women who would come after her, proving that a female artist could sit at the very top of the genre, not just visit it. Television soon became another stage for her talents. From 1980 to 1982, NBC aired Barbara Mandrell and the Mandrell Sisters, a primetime variety show starring Barbara alongside Louise and Earlene. In a single episode, she might sing, switch instruments, dance, and deliver comedy, showing audiences the full breadth of what she could do. The show was a genuine hit, but the pace behind the scenes was brutal. Weekly television production, combined with touring and recording, put enormous strain on her voice, and eventually the toll became serious enough that she had to end the show at the peak of its popularity, simply to protect her instrument. She returned in 1983 with a Las Vegas production called The Lady is a Champ, alongside an HBO special, proving the setback hadn't slowed her down. It was in the middle of this extraordinary run of success that Barbara Mandrell made a decision that would attach itself to her name for the rest of her life. She decided to build a home. Not a mansion meant to broadcast wealth, but something with a much more personal purpose behind it. Construction finished in 1988 on an estate she named Fontanelle. The name itself tells you what she was after. A fontanelle is the soft spot on a baby's skull, the delicate, unprotected place before the bones fuse and harden. Mandrell chose that word deliberately. She wanted this property to be her family's soft spot, a place of safety and rest, shielded from the pressures of a very public life. Many stars at her level might have chosen a name meant to impress. She chose one built around tenderness and vulnerability instead, and once you know that, the entire estate reads differently. It stops looking like a monument to fame and starts looking like a shelter, built by someone who understood exactly how quickly life could be taken away. And she understood that in the most painful way possible. Years before Fontanelle was finished, Mandrell had nearly lost her life, along with 2 of her children, in a devastating car accident. That history is woven into every wall of the house she eventually built. The scale of Fontanelle was staggering. Estimates place the log structure at somewhere between 27,000 and 30,000 square feet, making it, at the time, the largest log home in the United States. It sat in Whites Creek, Tennessee, in a wooded valley roughly a 15-minute drive north of downtown Nashville. Reports on the total acreage vary, ranging anywhere from just over 100 acres to more than 200, but every account agrees that a gated driveway stretched roughly 1.5 miles from a road to the house itself, creating a sense of remove long before a visitor ever reached the front door. The construction process alone could fill its own documentary. The timber was selected in Montana, where the logs were first cut and assembled to make sure everything fit correctly. Then the entire structure was disassembled, with every log individually numbered, and shipped nearly 1,600 miles across the country to Tennessee, where it was reassembled piece by piece. Truckload after truckload arrived carrying the logs and the specialty lumber needed for the towering wood beam ceilings inside. It wasn't simply home construction. It was closer to relocating a piece of the Rocky Mountains into the hills outside Nashville. What rose from that effort was extraordinary. Fontanelle contained more than 20 rooms, including 6 bedrooms and 13 bathrooms. 5 fireplaces warmed the interior, and 2 full kitchens served the household. A dramatic angled skylight, held aloft by massive exposed wooden beams, flooded the main living areas with natural light. There was an indoor swimming pool with a cover that could convert the space into a dance floor, turning the room into an instant ballroom for entertaining. Outside, the property held an indoor shooting range, a helipad, a volleyball court, a flowing creek, 2 ponds fed by a 15-foot waterfall, hiking trails, a barn, and several smaller log cabins for extended family. One of those smaller structures, itself over 3,000 square feet, had actually housed the family while the main house was still under construction. From 1988 until 2002, Fontanelle was simply home. Barbara Mandrell, her husband Ken Dudney, and their 3 children lived there, and by every account it became exactly what she had hoped it would be. Behind that 1.5 miles of quiet, wooded driveway, one of the most recognizable women in America could step out of the spotlight entirely and just be a wife and a mother. But to understand why that kind of refuge mattered so much to her, you have to go back to September 11th, 1984, a day that nearly ended everything. That afternoon, near her home in Hendersonville, Tennessee, Barbara Mandrell was driving her car with 2 of her children, her son Matthew and her daughter Jamie, when a vehicle driven by a 19-year-old man named Mark White crossed the center line and struck her car head-on. Mark White was killed in the collision. That fact deserves to stay at the center of this story, because before it became part of Barbara Mandrell's biography, it was a devastating loss for another family entirely. Mandrell's own injuries were severe. She suffered a serious head injury, including a traumatic brain injury and significant concussion, along with a broken leg and numerous cuts. Her recovery stretched out over roughly a year and a half, during which she did not work at all. Yet within that terrible day was one detail that would go on to shape part of her public legacy. She had made certain her children were buckled into their seat belts, and because of that, both Matthew and Jamie survived the crash with only minor injuries. In the years that followed, Mandrell became an outspoken advocate for seatbelt safety, speaking publicly and often about how those belts had saved her children's lives at a time when many Americans still didn't buckle up as a matter of habit. The physical wounds, though, were only part of what she carried afterward. Mandrell later spoke candidly about the lasting mood swings and emotional pain that followed her traumatic brain injury, the kind of invisible damage that can linger long after cuts have healed and bones have set, reaching into memory, personality, and emotional control. She admitted that during the darkest stretch of her recovery, she seriously considered retiring for good. There was also a difficult public chapter. She and her husband filed a lawsuit against the estate of a young driver, seeking damages, a decision reportedly tied to insurance matters according to their attorney at the time. Even so, many fans reacted harshly, seeing only a famous woman suing the family of a teenager who had died. There was no clean hero or villain in that chapter, only a tragedy with consequences that rippled outward in every direction. Mandrell did come back. Beginning in 1985, she returned to recording and placed several more songs in the country top 10. She resumed touring, expanded into acting with television appearances throughout the late 80s and 90s, and in 1990 published her autobiography, Get to the Heart, My Story. The book spent months on the New York Times bestseller list and was later adapted into a television movie. What set it apart was her willingness to write honestly about the crash, the brain injury, and the long climb back toward herself, a level of candor that was unusual for a star of her stature at the time. Then, in 1997, while still enormously popular and still fully capable of performing at the highest level, Barbara Mandrell did something almost no one in her position ever does. She retired completely. At around 48 years old, she gave a farewell performance at the Grand Ole Opry House, filmed and broadcast as a special called Barbara Mandrell and the D-Wrights, The Last Dance. Her reasoning was simple and deeply personal. She wanted real time with her family, especially her youngest son, who was then still in high school. And unlike so many stars who announce a farewell, only to quietly return a few years later, Mandrell meant it. She sold her instruments. Aside from occasionally singing in church, she never returned to public performance in any regular way again. That kind of complete, deliberate exit is almost unheard of in entertainment. She didn't leave because of scandal or collapse. She left while she was still at the top, still admired, still fully capable, and she chose to stay gone. In 2009, she was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, cementing a legacy that no longer depended on staying visible. So what became of Fontanelle, the sprawling log refuge she built as a soft place to land? In 2002, the family moved out and downsized to a smaller home nearby, and the estate eventually passed into the hands of developers. Rather than let the property sit empty behind its long private drive, they opened it to the public around 2010, offering guided tours 7 days a week and promoting it as the only celebrity home in Nashville open for public visits. Guests could walk through the great room beneath that dramatic skylight, see the indoor pool, the shooting range, and the 13 bathrooms, and view memorabilia tied to Mandrell's career. Over time, the developers expanded the site into a full entertainment destination, adding an outdoor concert amphitheater, a winery, a distillery location, zip lines through the surrounding woods, a bed and breakfast, a restaurant, and a gift shop. For a stretch of years, the property even hosted a weekly live radio broadcast tied to the historic Grand Ole Opry station. In an unexpected turn, Mandrell's own daughter worked for a time as the estate's director of hospitality, welcoming visitors into the home she had once grown up in. Public tours eventually ended around 2019, and by 2022 the property, by then divided into multiple parcels, sold at auction for roughly $6 million. Under new ownership, the estate was restored and now operates as a private wedding and event venue, hosting celebrations beneath the same towering log walls that were once cut and numbered in Montana and rebuilt, log by log, into a Tennessee valley as a soft place for one family to land. That is the real story behind the footage now making its way around. Not a mystery, not a scandal, but the quiet arc of a woman who reached the very top of her profession, built a shelter for the people she loved most, survived something that nearly took her life and the lives of her children, and then, with full clarity and full choice, decided that the stage no longer needed to be hers. Look closely at the footage, and what you're really seeing isn't a hidden secret. It's a monument to a decision very few people in her position have ever had the courage to make. There is something else worth sitting with here, something that goes beyond the square footage and the truckloads of Montana timber. Barbara Mandrell's career was built on a kind of relentless, full-body discipline most performers never develop. She learned to control an instrument that demands both hands, both feet, and both knees working in coordination before she was even a teenager, and she carried that same discipline into every decade that followed, whether she was cutting an album, filming a weekly variety show, or standing on a Las Vegas stage recovering from vocal strain. That same discipline showed up again after the crash in 1984, when she chose, slowly and painfully, to rebuild a life and a career rather than let the accident define the rest of her story. And it showed up one final time in 1997, when she applied that same iron not toward staying on top, but toward walking away from it completely, at a moment when nearly everyone around her assumed she would eventually come back. It is worth remembering, too, that Fontanelle was never really about impressing anyone. The name she chose, tied to the soft, unguarded place on a newborn's skull, tells you everything about what she actually wanted out of all that success. Not a monument. Not a trophy house to be photographed for magazines, though it certainly was photographed plenty. What she wanted was somewhere her husband and her 3 children could exist without an audience, somewhere the woman who had spent nearly her entire life performing could simply stop performing. Given everything she had already survived by the time construction finished in 1988, that desire makes a certain kind of sense. She had already learned, in the most brutal way imaginable, that fame offered no protection from tragedy. A soft place to land wasn't an indulgence for her. It was closer to a necessity. And in the decades since she stepped away, that need for privacy never really faded. She has continued to live quietly in the Nashville area with Ken Dudney, the same Navy man and family band drummer she married back in 1967, in a marriage that has now lasted for decades far outside the public eye. Reports on her life since retirement describe simple things: gardening, cooking, time spent with grandchildren. It is a strikingly ordinary picture for a woman who once stood at the very top of an entire genre, who broke records no other artist had broken before her, and who built one of the largest privately owned log structures in American history. But that ordinariness may be exactly the point. She spent the first half of her life becoming one of the most visible entertainers in the country. She spent the second half making sure that visibility never got to define her again. So when new footage of Fontanelle surfaces, and people start asking what really happened inside those walls, the honest answer might be simpler and more moving than any hidden secret could ever be. What happened inside those walls was ordinary family life, deliberately protected at enormous cost by a woman who understood better than almost anyone in her profession just how fragile that kind of life can be, and who decided, when she had every reason not to, that it was worth protecting completely.